Hello, and welcome to the Voice of Market podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Carter. In this podcast, you will hear intriguing and thoughtful interviews as well as actionable tips, strategies that can be implemented either in institutions, health and wellness, and education. Our podcast is not about name recognition or being famous. Everyone has untapped potential. In today's fast-changing landscape demands nation leaders who can quickly adapt, build trust, and deliver value. Through people and technology, we're listening and providing insight on tough political and business challenges, including talent, transformation, geopolitical conflicts, pandemics, and social injustice. In this podcast series, Voice of Democracy offer insights to help you tackle today's challenges and prepare for tomorrow. Through social change, we will be the voice of democracy, American promise, global mission. Thanks for spending time with us today. Now, let's jump to your daily dose of Voice of Democracy. Today's highlight for this month of July, the podcast will be focused on taxing the U.S. rich. This will be a 4-part series podcast. Part 1, we will focus on America used to have a wealth tax, the forgotten history of property tax. Part 2 will focus on historical U.S. tax rates, timeline in taxing the rich. Part 3, tax evasion by millionaires and billionaires and the loopholes that they use. Part 4, how do the rich avoid paying taxes? Lastly, I will provide my conclusion recommendation after concluding all 4 series. We will start with part 1. Taxing the rich. America used to have a wealth tax, the forgotten history of property tax. First, let me open by saying, when Americans hear property tax, they tend to think taxes on houses and other real estate. And for good reason. While property taxes are often levied on motor vehicles and occasionally on business net worth, the vast majority of property tax in the U.S. today apply only to real estate. It was not always so. So let's get started. The historic general property tax applied to almost all property, including intangibles like stock, bonds, cash on hand, accounts receivable, and interest in a partnership. Once a mainstay of American public finance, the general property tax helped finance the nation's early industrial growth. Over time, these broad wealth taxes were withered away to become the narrow property taxes we have today. These selective wealth taxes apply to the kinds of wealth that make up a large share of middle-class families' net worth, like homes and cars, but usually exempt most of the net worth of the wealthy, like business equity, bonds, and pool investment funds. The rationale for this pared-back approach to wealth taxation has grown weaker in recent decades as inequality has worsened. The share of wealth held outside real estate has increased, and the tools needed to administer a broad wealth tax have improved. The general property tax was an idea ahead of its time in reviving this American tradition in some form or worth a closer look. Now let's discuss the general property taxation. In the immediate postbellum, or should I say, the American Civil War, U.S. property taxes routinely use a broad definition of property. That meant real estate to be sure, but also real personal property such as valuable possessions, vehicles, livestock, etc. An intangible personal property value of debts, business equity, intellectual property, and etc. Local general property tax receipts grew dramatically for decades, from about 2% of gross domestic product in the 1850s to 5% in the 1920s. These collections were substantial. In 1902, local revenues were close to state and national revenues combined, but by the 1930s, cracks were beginning to show in the system as states had trouble enforcing their taxes. The United States, Michigan's experience offer a useful illustration. At the turn of the 20th century, the state of Michigan was about to enter a period of remarkable dynamics and prosperity powered by the Great Migration and the automobile industry. In 1893, the state passed the General Property Tax Act, which authorized the state's property tax to this day, albeit in an extensively amended form. Its aim to tax the fair market value of property in the state. At the time, this was standard. In 1893, Michigan taxed all property, including intangibles, at the same percentage of its face value. Over time, different rates were introduced for different property types to promote greater compliance with the tax. As 1940, the state had an expensive intangible property tax that included monies on hand, on deposit or in transit, shares of stock and other units of interest in corporations, and all other credits and evidence of indebtedness, whether such intangible personal property is secured or unsecured. The tax rates on these properties were generally lower than on real property. The state charge for most intangible property was a greater of 0.1% of the face value of 3% of the income generated. For shares of stock in building or saving and loan association, the rate was 0.04% or 0.40% per $1,000. While Michigan offers a good example of post-Belgian general property taxes, much of the country also considered enslaved people to be taxable property before the Civil War. As the National Bureau of Economic Research documented dated March of 2023, Southern states' definition of taxable property was inflated through the inclusion of enslaved people in the base. After chattel slavery was abolished by force, the general property tax base in southern states declined to levels more on par with the base in non-southern states. Of course, the effects of chattel slavery lasted long past the emancipation and are still felt today. Today, the regions of the South where slavery were most prevalent and Black Americans generally both have far lower levels of wealth than in the rest of the country. So now we'll look at the pivot to income taxes. The early 20th century was a pivot point for American tax policy. In the immediate post-Belgium U.S. property tax administration was less formalized than it is today. Real property, acres of land, barrels of bourbon, head of cattle was a relatively public display by markets were smaller and less liquid, and therefore assets were often difficult to value. Although property tax did raise significant revenue, assessments were less than comprehensive, constrained as they were by the technology of the day. As the tax historian Joseph Thorndike has explained, the general property tax was a tax ill-suited to a world choke full of intangible property, but not yet endowed with a reliable means of making that property visible to tax authorities. Less of a problem these days, of course. The classic contemporary objection to the practices, and surely by one scholar, Edwin R.A. Singelman, who was an American economist who spent his entire academic career at Columbia University in New York City. Seligman is best remembered for his pioneer work involving taxation and public finance, 1890 broadside against a general property tax, which concludes, the general property tax puts a premium of dishonest and debauches the public conscience. It is the cause of such crying injustice that it is abolished must become a battle cry for every statesman and reformer. The views of people ultimately prevailed and were held among in 1913 when progressives won the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which gave Congress power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard of any sense of enumeration. As American governance became more professional and formal in the beginning of the 20th century, the tool of general property tax was supplemented, meaning replaced by a gradual income tax. Income taxes were easier to administer, and to this day they remain the strongest progressive element of the U.S. tax system. As the federal government increasingly turned to a broad-based gradual income tax for revenue, states' reliance on property tax also began to trail off. Although state property tax receipts continued to grow in a nominal term well into the 20th century, they did not derive states' dramatic expansion in revenue. Instead, states turned toward new taxes on personal income and general sales, and toward taxing the rapidly growing auto industry. And so, by 1965, the University of Duke economics professor and later Chancellor John O. Blackburn called the taxation of intangible property of negligible importance. However, even then, 14 states still had broad taxation of intangible property. Those states were Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Virginia. Each of those would be repealed not long thereafter. Ultimately, the demise of general property tax was partly the result of an understandable but ultimately misguided belief that new forms of personal income taxation coming onto the scene made wealth taxation unnecessary or duplicity. However, as we know now, the income tax, while in many cases a powerful tool for progressive taxation, is often not particularly adept at reaching the fortunes of the very wealthy. Looking ahead now, while reasonable people can debate the most effective means of taxing wealth, there's a strong case to be made for bringing back heavier levies on the fortune of the wealthy. Wealth inequality has increased considerably since the middle of the 20th century, when the general property tax was being hollowed out. Progress toward addressing racial wealth inequality, measured as the difference between white and black per cap, wealth began to stall out around the same time. Our current system of selective wealth taxation through the property tax is largely negligent, in some ways even worsen these problems. Data from the Federal Reserve indicate that the bottom 90% of the families have more than half of their net worth tied up in real estate, whereas the top 1% have 13% of their wealth in real estate. A similar pattern is present across race and ethnic groups. White families hold just 27% of their wealth in real estate, while Black and Hispanic families hold 40% and 58% respectively. At the same time, real estate has also been declining as a share of total net worth, meaning that the narrow property taxes we have on the books today apply to a shrinking share of overall wealth. In other words, wealthy families, particularly wealthy white families, have a far lower share of their net worth subject to property taxation than other groups. They also have a lower share of their wealth being taxed today than they did just a few decades ago, as intangible assets have grown in prominence. Given our nation's high level of inequality and the unequal opportunities it affords based on race and class, a return to a broader system of wealth taxation is worth a closer look. Recent advances in tax administration also make a return to a broader wealth taxation more feasible. Measuring and cataloging property values in the pre-digital age was no small undertaking, but modern accounting and financial practices are more comprehensive, efficient, and traceable than in the early 20th century. The right-leaning Tax Foundation, for instance, has explained that in our modern era, taxing wealthy consisting of unrealized gains from a public traded asset is relatively straightforward. Valuing assets with a clear and visible public value is more challenging, of course, but reasonable valuations can be derived at by looking at the income streams those assets produce. The argument used by opponents of the general property tax are no longer as convincing as they once were, and the limitations of taxing only the income but not wealth in our highly unequal nation have begun to come into a sharper view. With these concerns in mind, it's time to revisit whether past tax reforms were wrong or narrow the general property tax and how best to restore the U.S. tradition of broader wealth taxation. The case for taxing wealth today is more compelling than ever. For our outpost, this broadcast was brought to you by the People First Consulting Voice of Democracy. For more information about People First Consulting Voice of Democracy, please visit our website at www.pfcworks.com. Remember, this is a 4-part series on taxing the U.S. rich. Stay tuned for part 2, which is Taxing the U.S. Rich, a historical U.S. tax rates timeline. My conclusion recommendation will be provided upon completing part 4 series of Taxing the U.S. Rich. American Promise, Global Mission. Thank you for tuning in and listening today. Until next time, please be safe, stay informed, and live well.